What happens when the last strategic port of a nation built on Western promises falls to the forces Washington swore would never prevail? On a cold morning that most Americans will scroll past without a second thought, the city of Odesa, Ukraine's gateway to the Black Sea, stands on the precipice of a transformation that will reshape not just Eastern Europe, but the entire architecture of global power. This isn't just about one city. This is about the unraveling of an empire's credibility, the exposure of 3 decades of strategic delusion, and the acceleration of a multipolar world order that Washington spent trillions trying to prevent. The fall of Odessa represents something far more profound than a military defeat. It represents the moment when American hegemony, that unipolar dominance we've enjoyed since 1991, began its terminal decline. And the architects of this catastrophe, the very people who promised victory, who assured us that Russia would collapse under sanctions, who told us that Ukraine would prevail, are the same voices now scrambling to rewrite history before the ink is even dry. Stay with me through this analysis. What I'm about to reveal challenges everything the mainstream media has told you about this conflict. If you value independent analysis and geopolitical truth, leave a like, share your perspective in the comments, and subscribe. This isn't about numbers. It's about building a community that sees through the propaganda. The implications of what's unfolding in Odessa reach far beyond the Black Sea coast, and understanding them requires us to abandon the comfortable narratives that have dominated Western discourse for far too long. I'm John Mearsheimer, and for over 4 decades, I've studied how great powers rise, how they overextend, and how they fall. I've watched empires make desperate moves as their dominance slips away, clinging to illusions long after reality has rendered them obsolete. But what I'm witnessing now, this systematic dismantling of American credibility in real time, is unprecedented in its speed and its totality. As a realist who has spent his career analyzing the cold logic of international relations, I recognize patterns that others miss or refuse to acknowledge. And the pattern unfolding in Odessa right now is one I warned about years ago, a pattern that Western policymakers dismissed as pessimism, as defeatism, as somehow unpatriotic. They were wrong then. They are wrong now. And their wrongness will cost us dearly. To understand why Odessa matters, we must go back to February 2014, to the Maidan revolution that wasn't quite a revolution, to the moment when Washington made a choice that would set in motion everything that followed. The United States, working through the usual networks of NGOs and diplomatic pressure, supported the overthrow of Ukraine's democratically elected president. The goal was simple and, from Washington's perspective, entirely reasonable. Bring Ukraine into the Western sphere of influence, eventually into NATO, and complete the encirclement of Russia that began with the eastward expansion of the alliance in the 1,990 seconds. I was one of the few voices in American academia warning that this policy was catastrophically misguided, that Russia would view NATO expansion to Ukraine as an existential threat, and that pushing this agenda would lead to war. I was dismissed, marginalized, told I was giving Putin talking points, but here we are, exactly where the logic of great power politics said we would be. Russia's response in 2014 was measured and strategic. They secured Crimea, their warm water naval base at Sevastopol, and they supported separatist movements in the Donbass. For 8 years, a frozen conflict simmered, and during those 8 years, Washington doubled down on the same policy. More weapons to Ukraine, more NATO integration, more provocative exercises on Russia's border. In December 2021, Russia presented a series of demands to NATO, essentially asking for a return to the security architecture that existed before NATO expansion began. Those demands were dismissed out of hand. Washington believed Russia was bluffing, that Putin would never actually invade, that even if he did, sanctions would cripple the Russian economy within weeks and force a humiliating withdrawal. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. When Russian forces crossed into Ukraine in February 2022, the Western response was swift and predictable. We unleashed the most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. We froze Russian central bank assets, expelled Russia from SWIFT, sanctioned thousands of individuals and entities, and promised that the Russian economy would be reduced to rubble. European leaders announced they would wean themselves off Russian energy. Western weapons poured into Ukraine by the billions, and the narrative, the story we told ourselves and the world, was clear. Ukraine would fight, Russia would collapse, and Putin would fall. That was the plan. But plans, especially plans built on wishful thinking rather than cold strategic calculus, have a way of colliding with reality. Let me pause here and invite you into this analysis. In the comments below, share your assessment. Did Western sanctions achieve their objectives, or did they backfire? Your perspective matters. Each comment adds to a collective understanding that transcends mainstream narratives. I read these discussions, and they often reveal insights that even academics miss. Take a moment, share your analysis, and let's build this understanding together. Because what happened next, the actual consequences of Western policy rather than the intended consequences, reveals something profound about the shifting balance of global power. But here's what Washington doesn't understand or refuses to acknowledge. Russia didn't collapse. Instead, Russia adapted with a speed and sophistication that caught Western policymakers completely off guard. The Russian economy reoriented toward Asia, toward the global South, toward the very countries that Washington assumed would follow our lead in isolating Moscow. China stepped in as a massive buyer of Russian energy, paying not in dollars but in yuan and rubles. India increased its purchases of Russian oil, refining it and selling it back to Europe at a markup. Turkey, a NATO member, became a crucial hub for Russian trade and finance. And the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, began accelerating their plans for an alternative financial architecture, one that doesn't depend on Western banks or the dollar system. We didn't isolate Russia. We isolated ourselves from a massive portion of the global economy. And while Washington was busy congratulating itself on the strength of its sanctions, Russia was grinding through Ukrainian defenses with the methodical brutality of a great power that has no illusions about what war actually requires. The Western media showed us images of Ukrainian victories, of captured Russian tanks, of a Russian military that was supposedly incompetent and demoralized. Those images were real, but they weren't the whole story. The whole story was a war of attrition, a grinding, brutal conflict where Russia's advantages in artillery, in industrial capacity, in sheer demographic weight would eventually prevail. I said this in 2022, I said it in 2023, and now, as Russian forces approach Odesa, as that final jewel in Ukraine's strategic crown teeters on the edge, the truth is becoming undeniable. The irony is breathtaking. We told the world that this war was about defending democracy, about protecting sovereignty, about standing up to aggression. But what we actually did was provide Ukraine with just enough support to prolong the conflict, to maximize the destruction, to bleed both Ukraine and Russia without ever providing the level of support that might actually change the outcome on the battlefield. We gave them weapons, but not enough to win. We gave them intelligence, but not enough to prevail. We gave them promises, endless promises of support for as long as it takes. But when it came to the hard choices, the choices that might risk direct confrontation with a nuclear power, we blinked. And Ukraine, the country we claim to be defending, has paid the price in blood and treasure and territorial integrity. Now, let us transform this analysis into a global conversation. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, your country, your city, your corner of the world. Sun Win reads every comment with genuine interest. And to each of you, wherever you are, we send this message. The pursuit of truth knows no borders. Your perspective, shaped by your unique position in this world, enriches our collective understanding. Share your location and let's map the reach of critical thinking. Because what I'm about to explain next, the deeper implications of Odesa's fall, requires perspectives from every continent, from every culture that has watched this tragedy unfold. The real story isn't just the fall of a city. The real story is what that fall represents for the global order. Odesa isn't just a port, it's a symbol. It's the last major Ukrainian city with access to the Black Sea. Its fall would mean that Ukraine becomes a landlocked state, economically crippled, dependent entirely on the goodwill of its neighbors for access to global markets. But more importantly, Odesa's fall would represent the complete failure of Western strategy in Ukraine, the definitive proof that our promises were empty, that our support was insufficient, and that our willingness to confront a determined great power was never as strong as our rhetoric suggested. And the world is watching. Every country that has ever relied on American security guarantees is watching and asking themselves a simple question. If Washington couldn't save Ukraine, a country on Europe's doorstep, a country that received hundreds of billions in aid, what makes us think Washington would save us? Standing in my office at the University of Chicago, looking at maps of Eastern Europe that I've studied for decades, I'm struck by the historical parallel. In 1956, the United States encouraged Hungarians to rise up against Soviet domination, broadcasting messages of support through Radio Free Europe, promising that the West would come to their aid. When the Hungarian uprising began, when people took to the streets believing American support was coming, the Eisenhower administration did nothing. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushed the rebellion, and thousands died believing in promises that were never meant to be kept. Ukraine is Hungary in reverse, except this time we didn't just encourage resistance. We armed it, we trained it, we embedded ourselves so deeply in Ukrainian strategy that the world assumed we would never let it fail. But fail it has. And the psychological shock, the revelation that American commitments are conditional, that our support has limits, is reverberating across every alliance we've built. But the transformation goes deeper than military defeat or diplomatic embarrassment. It's civilizational. For 3 decades after the Cold War, the American model was presented as universal, as the inevitable endpoint of historical development. Liberal democracy, free markets, integration into Western institutions, this was the path, the only path to prosperity and security. The fall of the Soviet Union seemed to confirm this narrative. But what's happening now? What Russia's success in Ukraine, despite Western opposition, reveals is that alternative models are not just possible, but potentially more resilient than the neoliberal order Washington tried to export. Russia didn't adopt Western political systems, didn't embrace Western economic orthodoxy, and yet they've weathered the most comprehensive sanctions regime in history and emerged stronger in many ways than before. That's not propaganda. That's an observable reality. And for every nation in the global South that is chafed under Western-imposed structural adjustment programs, under IMF conditionality, under the demand that they open their markets while Western nations protect their own, Russia's resilience offers a different possibility. Looking ahead, several scenarios are possible, none of them comfortable for Washington. The first scenario is continued escalation. As Odesa falls, as the strategic picture in Ukraine deteriorates further, there will be voices in Washington calling for more aggressive action, for direct NATO involvement, for a no-fly zone, for boots on the ground. These voices will argue that American credibility demands we double down, that retreat now would be catastrophic for our alliances worldwide. This path leads toward direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, between the United States and a nuclear-armed great power, over terrain that no American vital interest requires us to defend. It is madness, but madness has a way of presenting itself as courage in moments of desperation. The second scenario is a face-saving compromise. Perhaps as Odesa falls, Western leaders will suddenly discover the virtues of negotiation, of diplomatic settlement, of recognizing that Ukraine's NATO membership was never realistic anyway. We'll see op-eds explaining how a neutral Ukraine is actually a victory for Western values, how avoiding direct war with Russia was always the goal, and how the real achievement was bleeding Russian military capacity. This narrative will attempt to reframe defeat as strategy, to turn humiliation into wisdom. It will fail to convince anyone outside the Western bubble, but it may provide enough political cover for leaders to extricate themselves from a commitment they never should have made. The third scenario, and the one I find most likely, is gradual decline. Odesa falls, the West continues to support what remains of Ukraine with enough aid to prevent complete collapse, but not enough to restore lost territory. The conflict freezes into a new status quo, one in which Russia controls a third of Ukraine's pre-2022 territory and all of its Black Sea coast. Western support slowly diminishes as other crises demand attention, as the costs become less politically sustainable, as the realization sets in that we were never going to reverse Russian gains. And Ukraine, the country we claim to be saving, becomes a broken, impoverished buffer state, a monument to the gap between American promises and American capabilities. Before I deliver my final assessment, let me speak directly to you. What you have just heard is not merely analysis. It is a framework for understanding the most significant power shift in modern history. Mainstream media will not tell you these things. They cannot, because their function is to maintain comfortable illusions, not to reveal uncomfortable truths. If this kind of analysis resonates with you, if you believe the world needs more voices willing to speak against the prevailing narrative, then subscribe to this channel. This is not about building an audience. It is about building a community of people who refuse to accept propaganda as truth. The next video will go even deeper into the economic warfare that is reshaping global finance, into the de-dollarization that is accelerating precisely because of the weaponization of the dollar system in this conflict. Subscribe now so you don't miss what mainstream media will never tell you. Together, we are not just watching history unfold, we are understanding it. The fall of Odesa, whether it comes in weeks or months, marks the end of more than just Ukraine's access to the Black Sea. It marks the end of the unipolar moment, that brief period after 1991, when American power seemed unchallengeable, when Washington could impose its will on any region, could overthrow governments, could sanction entire economies into submission without facing meaningful resistance. That moment is over. The world we are entering is multipolar, messy, competitive, and significantly more dangerous than the stable hegemony we once enjoyed. But here's the tragedy. This transition didn't have to be this chaotic, this destructive, this humiliating. If American policymakers had understood the basic logic of great power politics, if they had recognized that pushing NATO to Russia's borders would provoke exactly the response it provoked, if they had prioritized stability over expansion, we could have managed this transition peacefully. Instead, we chose illusion over reality, ideology over interest, and moral posturing over strategic wisdom. We told Ukraine to fight Russia, promised them support, and then provided just enough aid to ensure the fight would be long and bloody, but not enough to ensure victory. We imposed sanctions that didn't cripple Russia, but did accelerate the fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs. We spent our credibility, our treasure, and Ukraine's blood in pursuit of a goal, Russian defeat and regime change, that was never achievable without risking nuclear war. And now, as Odesa falls, as the bills come due, as our allies quietly begin hedging their bets and exploring alternatives to American security guarantees, we face a choice. We can continue down this path, doubling down on failed strategies, escalating toward conflicts we cannot win, bankrupting ourselves in pursuit of hegemony we can no longer maintain. Or we can adapt to the reality of a multipolar world, prioritize genuine American interests over global dominance, and rebuild a foreign policy based on restraint rather than endless intervention. The question isn't whether American hegemony is ending. That ship has sailed, and Odesa is just one more confirmation of a process that has been underway for years. The question is whether we will manage that decline peacefully, whether we will recognize our limitations before those limitations are demonstrated in even more catastrophic ways, or whether we will rage against the dying of the light until we've exhausted ourselves and impoverished our own people in the process. History teaches us what happens when empires refuse to accept their own decline. They overextend, they bankrupt themselves, they turn inward with recriminations and political chaos, and they collapse not from external conquest but from internal exhaustion. We are not there yet, but every day we continue policies built on illusions rather than interests. We take one step closer. The world is watching. The mask has slipped. And what lies beneath? A declining hegemon desperate to maintain the illusion of invincibility, willing to sacrifice allies to avoid admitting limits, is far more fragile than anyone in Washington wants to acknowledge. Odesa is falling. Ukraine is being dismembered. American credibility is evaporating. And the question is no longer whether we can reverse these trends. The question is whether we have the wisdom to adapt to them before they consume us entirely. The clock is ticking.